called Shavuot because we count 7 Shavuot, 7 weeks from the Sabbath of Passover. And then we have the holiday of Shavuot, which is a harvest holiday. So since the Sabbath of Passover is always on a Saturday, from the perspective of the Bible, Shavuot will always come out on a Sabbath. Now, this got all changed up by the rabbis, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow night and Shabbat morning. In any case, from the perspective of the rabbis, we had a holiday that was almost vacant of meaning all you did was finish counting 7 weeks. The 50th week was the official ending of the 7 weeks. Nothing happened on the 50th day. And you have a huge event that had no date, the giving of Torah. So the rabbis of the Talmudic era decided to match the two up. And it was pretty close, but it's still, there is some gap here, but close enough. And therefore, the rabbis of the Talmudic era assigned the giving of Matan Torah, the giving of Torah, Exodus chapter 20, to the 6th of Sivan, which starts tonight. So if you're looking for it in the Torah, you're not going to find it. It's not in the Torah. By the way, as I will teach tomorrow night, the term the 10 Commandments is nowhere in the Torah. That might be a surprise to some people. I'll explain that more tomorrow night and Shabbat morning as well. So the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the idea of staying all night for a study session, as far as I know, is not mentioned in the Midrash and the Talmud. Is not really mentioned anywhere until I think the period of the Zohar. And some say it's because of the appearance of coffee in the Middle East, where people actually could stay up all night. And then they made up these ideas that we stay up all night because we fell asleep at Mount Sinai. So once we start doing something, we find reasons for doing it. But what was a tikkun? People created a pamphlet that had, for example, the first line of every verse of the Bible, of the Torah, by extension the Bible, and some put a first line of every chapter of the Mishnah. So it's called a tikkun, which is a set of verses that stand for the entire tradition. And people would chant this and probably go into ecstatic states. So we no longer have, some communities might use a tikkun, which means a pamphlet containing this array of verses. It came to mean studying all night. So many places, including the history of Oratora, we've had speakers virtually all night. We curtailed that a little bit, but then I oftentimes went off to another synagogue where I was asked to be the 12 o'clock speaker, the 1 o'clock speaker. After the major rabbis left, I pulled the midnight shift. A lot of fun, but it's not something I don't think I can be doing anymore. So we're keeping the idea of an extended study session. So instead of the 45 minutes or an hour that I allow myself on a Shabbat morning, go a little bit longer, hopefully a little more leisurely pace, but probably not. And what I like to do is review what I've been doing the past 7 weeks, is providing an introduction to the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah. The reason is many people who jump into the study of the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah don't know anything about the Kabbalah, or what they know is mostly misinformation. And then I use up a lot of my time giving people the straight dope on the origins of the Kabbalah, and it takes a while to get to the spiritual psychology. So as you know, we're putting this online on YouTube, by the way. There are people from Chile, South America watching, so buenos noches from Ciudad de Los Angeles. Did I say that right, Yosh? Okay. The city of the angels. We have people in the UK. We have people in other places in Europe. So to all of our listeners across the US and South America and Europe, welcome. Thank you for watching the YouTube. I want to remind everybody, it would be great if you hit the like. That for some reason that is like a prayer that goes out into the universe, and then good things happen from that. I don't quite understand it, but it doesn't cost much as far as I understand. All right, so we're going to get down to an introduction to the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah. So as I said at the very beginning, my inspiration for the details of the teaching come from this book. If you're going to have one book, this would be it, Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem. People want to put this in the chat. I've worn out another copy. This is my replacement copy. I've been teaching this material for my entire career. This is a collection of Gershom Sholom's articles from Encyclopedia Judaica, which were collected into one book. So Sholom is the person to study if you only have one person, one book to study. His prior book to this, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, is actually pretty dense for most people. And then, of course, there is an entire library of books on every single aspect of what I'll be teaching tonight. But I want to try to keep things as understandable and therefore as simple as possible and make room for questions. So here's what Sholom says on page 45 in this book, something we should keep in mind. Sholom says, let's see. Top of page 45. The Kabbalah, in its historical significance, can be defined as the product of the interpenetration of Jewish Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. So I would infer from that, for us to understand the historical dimension of the Kabbalah, we should know something about Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, which is where we spent a lot of time. So first I want to review the idea, one core idea of Gnosticism and then a few more. A core idea of what came to be called Gnosticism is the reality of evil. Now, I'm going to explain some of the details of ancient Gnosticism, but for our purposes, I want to compare it to ancient Neoplatonism. Most people today who call themselves spiritual, sometimes spiritual but not religious, aren't quite aware that they are part of the Neoplatonic tradition, usually. Meaning there's a higher power. The higher power reveals itself in layers. Depending on one's consciousness as a human being, one can get closer and closer to the source of the light. I'm using a vertical metaphor. Sometimes it's a descending metaphor, meaning the closer and closer you get to the soul. So the idea that the divine light, the infinity of the divine, goes through lenses or veils is a core idea of Neoplatonism in general and also Jewish Neoplatonism. Why Platonism? Because as Plato discusses this, meaning Plato using the character of Socrates, if you want to read one dialogue, it would be the Timaeus, where they talk about different kinds of knowledge, the idea of the higher world, of the forms, the demiurge. So if you want to look at one Platonic dialogue that I think kicks off Gnosticism, it would be the Timaeus. Many other philosophers, but I want to keep it simple tonight. So the idea of in Gnosticism is there are higher worlds and that lends down to our world, but the intermediaries in Gnosticism are evil. So the idea of the demiurge in Plato Socrates, which is just the emanation of God that constructs the world, the worker God, as it were. It's called the demiurge. Orgon meaning to work, demi, half, something like that. The demiurge came to identify with a fallen angel, a fallen divine force that blocked this world off from the higher world, and this evil demonic force runs our world. So that's a basic Gnostic attitude that what we call the bad or evil is not just the absence of the good. It is actually an active force, and it secretly runs the world. Now, what happens when you become aware that there's this secret, evil, demonic force running the world? You become a knower, which is the root of the word Gnostic. Avigal pointed out the only time you hear the word G in Gnostic is when you're an agnostic. I thought that was brilliant, so I'll be quoting that the rest of my life. So the Gnostic believes there's this evil force. I want to just give you a modern analogy. I don't want to defend it too strongly, so if you don't like it, just don't like it. We don't have to argue about it. Sometimes people will say to me, isn't the world just run by capitalism and corporations? Okay? and and as if it's an evil force. And so, as per my leaning, I would say, well, can you define corporation? Which most people who believe that it's evil can't. And I said, you mean like Ben and Jerry's, Adidas? And then they realized that they've attributed evil to the word corporation, not being able to quite define what a corporation is. And then they say capitalism, which is a term, of course, comes from Marx. As you know, I had to study Marx when I was in graduate school, so I know something about Marx and capitalism. What most people think about capitalism is not capitalism. If we mean profit incentive, I think that was the first time someone changed a spearhead for some salt, meaning someone wants to come away with a little bit more, and then the next trade down the line, someone ends up with a little bit more. So the idea of a profit incentive expands until we might have the modern system of regulated free trade, banking system, and so forth. So when people say capitalism is evil, I say, well, what is capitalism? They usually say greed. I say, okay, are there any people who are in business to make a profit, like your, I don't know, your local falafel stand? Are they greedy? And people say, okay, I don't mean the local falafel stand. Of course, they want to make a profit. So people say, okay, let me retract that. There's evil in the world. Some people are evil. Some corporations are evil. And sometimes capitalism turns into greed. That's a fair statement. But the first statement, notice the Gnostic tenor. There's an evil force running the world, corporations and capitalism. And we don't know that they're running our lives, we, the average person, except the Gnostic, the one who knows. They have access to secret knowledge. I can give you many other examples of people who say, I know what's really going on in the world. I'm a knower. There's something rotten going on, and I will tell you. The problem is, it's usually built in some kind of, as is Gnosticism, some kind of mythic system which cannot stand rational questioning, because myths aren't rational. Okay? So the Neoplatonism as an idea, I think, pervades our society. Gnosticism as an idea pervades our society. Gnostic orientations in religions keep appearing, probably every 50 to 100 years. All right, so that's the Gnostic flavor, the Gnostic tenor, which one finds throughout Jewish mysticism, throughout Kabbalah, even into Hasidism, and I think well into every version of every modern society. Again, maybe it not be dominant in some societies, but it's certainly present that there's an evil force out to get us, and we have to fight it. It's not every day of history, every place in history, but when you look at Jewish history, you see it pops up in England, it pops up in Germany, it pops up in North Africa. So yes, it's a pervasive idea, especially in Christianity, mostly because of the Gospel of John chapter 8, where Jews are called the children of Satan. It's an unfortunate turn of phrase. I don't believe Jesus possibly thought this. I'm not even sure that the John of the Gospels thought it. Whoever wrote that, I think it was a long time after. So I really don't believe this to be a central tenet of authentic Christianity. Of course, people will use even the most slim evidence to call somebody else evil. So the idea of calling someone else evil, not just the Jews, as you know, is extremely common. So in a place where there are no Jews, the Hutus will hunt down the Tutsis. In a place where there are no Jews, the Sunnis will hunt down the Shia. So all over the world, there is an evil other, depending on the culture, depending on society. So, for example, the kulaks under Stalin, small property owners were painted as evil, and Stalin probably murdered about, as far as I know, several million kulaks. So all throughout history, societies have had to come up with the other, capital O, and then destroy them. First, defame them, by the way. First, call them the worst things you can probably call them, depending on the culture, obviously. And once you call them the worst names, then you're licensed to destroy them, or at least hate them in Western societies, and sometimes that rises to violence. So the Gnostic tenor is with us. I conclude my first paragraph of thought, what I'll call the tenor of Gnosticism, the tenor of Neoplatonism. Okay, let's get down to cases. So where does the term Gnosticism come from? So I actually have a note here. The term Gnosticism can be attributed to the Bishop of Lyon in France, Irenaeus, who arrived from Rome to take over the devastated Christian community there. And once he arrived, not only did he discover that they had been devastated by riots and massacres and discrimination, what he considered to be Orthodox faith had challenges. So we have to remember here, in the first couple centuries of Christianity, there was no Orthodox faith. You might say that the so-called Orthodox faith enshrined in the Council of Nicaea, Chalcedon, those were forcible attempts to straighten out the belief. Orthodoxy means straightening out the belief. Well, there was no orthodoxy. In fact, Irenaeus is probably one of the figure second only to Paul who created Christianity. So as he gets to Lyon, he's realizing that there are other groups teaching something different. So he wrote a book called On the Detection and Overthrow of So-Called Knowledge, pseudo-Gnosticism, as it were. But the term Gnosticism actually stuck. He wanted to be called pseudo-Gnosticism because he considered himself and the evolving, meaning straight belief church, to be the true knowers. But because of the title of the book, the word Gnostic came to refer to all, from the point of view of Irenaeus, these different discordant forces that had something in common. So Gnosticism, in a formal, technical way, refers to what he would call heretical Christians. If you went back to the time when he taught, he was the heretic. So there was a fight on what Christianity was, and what we would call the point of view of Irenaeus is the one that succeeded. So because of the nature of these different Gnostic groups, and you can go back and look at books. I mean, I have here, I shared with you a wonderful book that I have called The Gnostic Bible, Barnstone and Meyer, The Gnostic Bible. Okay, so if you want to look up Gnostic texts, Valentinius, the Sethian Gnostics, the Hermetic teaching. So these things that many of us are heard of, these wonderful authors collected them into the Gnostic Bible. So what are some things they have in common? First of all, even pre-Christianity, we're gonna this not exactly it's a bit of an anachronism, but we'll go ahead and call those sectarian. We call them sectarians because they didn't evolve into official Judaism or official Christianity. So you'll forgive the term. What later were called sectarians rooted themselves on the Bible, but a retelling of biblical stories, often with the God of the Hebrew Bible being the demiurge, meaning the evil God. They retell the story of God, creation, Adam and Eve. The snake is the force of truth. The God figure in the Garden of Eden story is a force of evil. Adam has an entire, as it were, gospel attributed to him. So if you look at the Gospels, they use biblical stories, but they retell them in strikingly different ways, but very, very powerful, very convinced. So one theme is prior to Christianity, the use of the Bible, but not only Bible, also ancient Egyptian religion and Greek religion, but the Hebrew Bible seems to dominate. Secondly, they create complex mythologies populated by just lists and lists of different forces, different angels that emit from the realm of truth and light, and then devolve into some moment where some angel makes a terrible error and spawns the lower world. Sometimes it's an error. Sometimes it's a rebellious God. Sometimes it's a group of angels who rebel against the divine and spawn the lower world. So if I were to pick out one name of what I'm going to call early Jewish Gnosticism, it's an anachronism, but you'll get the idea that a biblical story is retold, and in the retelling, you end up with a vast mythology. You want one name? It's Enoch, E-N-O-C-H. Enoch has come down to us in 3 recensions: first Enoch, second Enoch, third Enoch. It's not hard to find. And if you can patiently make your way through the book of Hanoch, who is Hanoch? In the Hebrew Bible, he's a guy who, if I'm not mistaken, walked with God ve'enenu, and suddenly wasn't there. So they want, well, what happened to Hanoch, Enoch? So he ascended through stages and stages of terrible, hostile angels on his way to the throne room of God. First encountering the chief archangel of that higher realm called Metatron. And if you read these stories, they're just elaborate and fascinating. There are certain songs you have to sing. There are seals. You know, when the video game Zelda came out, I said, okay, somebody's read the book of Enoch here. So it's one seal, one room after another. So the books of Enoch have this very Gnostic feel. Now, after that, there is further Jewish mystical literature. If you want to look up one word, it's Merkava mysticism, M-E-R-K-A-V-A. And Merkava mysticism, again, is myths and hymns that talk about ascension to the divine. I have a book here by Gershom Scholem called Jewish Gnosticism, Merkava mysticism, and the Talmudic tradition. Gershom Scholem. Just type in Jewish Gnosticism. If you can find a copy, get it. They're hard to come by. So I went to, for me, it's a riveting book, by the way. He's such a great writer and such a clear thinker that if you're interested in this, you can't put the book down. I mean, it's really that good. Okay. Let's see. So in one Gnostic text, remember, this is those who ascend. They want to ascend to the realm of the Merkava. And there are gatekeepers and are described as, now this is in the higher realm, meaning on the way through the demiurge to the throne room. Angry and warlike, strong, harsh, willful, terrifying, taller than mountains, sharper than peaks. Their bows are strong and stand before them. Their swords are sharpened and in their hands. Lightning flows and issues forth from the balls of their eyes, balls of fire from their nostrils, torches of fiery coals from their mouth. They're equipped with helmets and coats of mail and javelin and spears. These are the angels. So sometimes when someone says, oh my God, your child looks so angelic, if they've read Merkava mysticism, it might not be the compliment that you think it is. So in that, going all the way up to the book of Enoch, which Scholem says was always dated far too late, and he's saying that these things came into being in the 1st century BCE. I might even push them earlier. Clearly, this Merkava mysticism existed in at least the 1st century BCE, as he demonstrates in this book. So, early Jewish Gnosticism you find in the books of Enoch, you find it in the Merkava mysticism, and they have that idea of there's a higher realm, a lower realm, an elaborate mythology, levels of different angels, and the idea that, at least in Merkava mysticism, you actually ascend from one chamber to the next. Now, you know that I talked about, if you want to read one Gnostic book, it's a short one, but amazing, is the so-called secret letter of John, the Apocryphon of John. Now, as far as I recall, it's not a book of ascension, but wow, what an elaborate mythology. It's unending in the filling out of one angelic realm after another. So we have what we'll call Jewish Gnosticism, as described by Sholem, Christian Gnosticism. Now, where did we find Christian Gnosticism? How do we know about it? We knew very little until 1945, when a set of texts were discovered called the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, named for the local hamlet in Egypt where they were found. Eventually found their way into booksellers. Scholars finally found them. They were in Coptic, ancient Egyptian, but clearly translated from Greek into Coptic. So the single greatest book that discusses the Gnostic Gospels, meaning the Gnostic tradition as discovered in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, is Elaine Pagel's, not mysteriously titled. She calls it the Gnostic Gospels, which is very unusual for anything Gnostic related. It is a terrific book. I mean, if you're interested in this, again, she's so readable, so knowledgeable, so approachable. By the way, she's written many other books. She's a deeply spiritual person, writes very deeply on her own life, on her experiences as a heterodox Christian. So if you ever want to tackle an author in the history of religion, Elaine Pagels is a great person to study. So that has really filled out our knowledge on ancient Gnosticism. These texts come down to us in a variety of ways. I don't want to talk about the history of Gnostic texts. You can study that another time. But there's been enough recovered and translated that they fill this book and other books called the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, if you want to look up that mouthful. So we know a lot about the ancient world. We know more about ancient Gnosticism and mysticism now than we've ever really known since the ancient world, because this literature was suppressed. That's why when they've discovered this literature, it's either in Slavonic, some out-of-the-way monastery in Eastern Europe. It's in Coptic, clearly translated from Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, and then found in these other language, and people worked to back translate them into what was possibly the original language. And of course, all of my volumes are in English. So you can look that up. So what does the Gnostic have? Unique knowledge of what is true, understood that we're down in this lower world, and only the Gnostic, the knower, knows that we're in this underworld, typically populated by elaborate mythologies, and very syncretistic, which means it connects itself with the Hebrew Bible, and then it connects itself with Christianity. Then it connected itself with Islam. The Hermetic tradition is a reinterpretation of Egyptian religion. So Gnosticism as a theme latches on to a prior tradition, then elaborately retranslates it, retells it. But the text, whether you're reading Jewish Gnosticism, Christian Gnosticism, Islamic Gnosticism, Hermetic Gnosticism, they're strikingly similar. So if you want to read a little bit of the book of Enoch, read a few passages of Merkava mysticism, any Christian Gnostic you want, Valentinius, Sethian literature. I like the Apocryphon of John because it's so short and so mind-blowing. And you'll definitely get a feel for ancient Gnosticism. All right, so what about this Neoplatonism? Alongside the developing of this Gnosticism was the Neoplatonic tradition. Why Neoplatonic? Because as complex as the Timaeus may seem to you, people could not withstand the urge to more complexity. And what the Neoplatonists did, some call them the Middle Platonists, the Neoplatonists, I'm not going to get into that. They created more and more, again, elaborate lenses. It's not the mythology of Gnosticism, it's an elaboration of the lenses. Okay? Now, if you, I think I brought it out. Yeah. If you want to take a look at a couple of pages of an absolutely stupefying book, meaning it will put you straight to sleep. It cures insomnia. It's the Plotinus, nothing to do with Plato, the Enneads. It is not the Enneagram. His student Porphyry decided to take the meandering teachings of his teacher Plotinus and organize them into 9 sections. So Enneads means the 9 books of Plotinus. I think I didn't do this during my original presentation, but I think I selected something just to. Now, I don't want anybody falling asleep, so I will only read a tiny section of this. But all sums to a unity, a comprehensive providence. From the inferior grade downwards is fate. The upper is providence alone. For in the intellectual cosmos, all is reason principle or its priors, divine mind and unmingled soul. And immediately upon those follows providence, which rises from the divine mind in the content of the unmingled soul, and through the soul is communicated to the sphere of all living things. I just read you one paragraph from this huge tome. He goes on and on and on and on. If you're interested in the definitive work of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, I actually read a biography of the author, Stephen McKenna. What a story! When this man was commissioned to translate Plotinus into English, there's a whole story there. Not a very happy one. So Stephen McKenna, the Enneads. All right, so we have Gnosticism developing. We have Neoplatonism developing. There's Jewish Gnosticism. There's Jewish Neoplatonism. They're coursing along until the entrance of a mysticism that displaces everything, the mysticism that came to be called the Kabbalah. So a few words on where the Kabbalah came from, and then I'll hit the pause and take a few questions. The Kabbalah came to being in the south of France in the late 1100s. What was happening there? Now, we actually have Gershom Scholem's book, The Origins of the Kabbalah. It's a huge book, amazingly detailed, from vast textual evidence, has been able to reconstruct the origins of the Kabbalah. One book in particular, which is the commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, an ancient Jewish Gnostic text, but using a scheme that is not in Sefer Yetzirah. So let me just say a quick word about that. In Sefer Yetzirah, you have what are called sfirot. Now the word, the Hebrew root, sin, pe, resh, is the root for a book. Sefer is the root for a number. Mispar is the root of to give an account, a sipur. So it's a deep word that cuts across many, many categories. And in the very beginning of Sefer Yetzirah, the unknown author says that there are Eser Sfirot. Now, then the author goes on to name them. They are, for example, the depth of up and the depth of down, the depth of the 4 directions, the depth of light, the depth of darkness, the depth of good, the depth of evil. I probably didn't enumerate them correctly, but the author goes on very quickly to say, and here are those 10, whatever a Sephirah is. Okay, put a post in that. Okay, so Sefer Yetzirah has been studied and commented upon for centuries. What happens in the south of France? There is a Gnostic Neoplatonic text arrives from Babylonia called Sefer Bahir. It shows up in the south of France. Now, it doesn't have Sfirot mentioned. It's what are called Ma'amarot. By the way, in the early Kabbalah, the word Sfirot was not universally accepted. I think Sholem lists 10 different synonyms for what we would call the Sfirot. Sefer Bahir shows up, and these early Kabbalists, including so-called Isaac the Blind, I don't believe he was blind. The Hebrew word for blind is sagi nahor, meaning full of light. So oftentimes when the Hebrew language wants to describe something negative, they give its opposite. I actually think he was sagi nahor, full of light. Sagi nahor is Aramaic. Maleh or. So he writes a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, but defining a Yetzirah along with Sefer Bahir as a Gnostic Neoplatonic emanatory system. So Yitzchak Sagi Nahor, Isaac the Blind's commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, which is not a commentary on Yetzirah, is the first articulation of a new mysticism called the Kabbalah. So we have Sefer Yetzirah in the background. We have the appearance of the book. I'm just telling what Sholem writes in his book. The appearance of the book Bahir. You have a Gnostic movement in the south of France called the Cathars. You have a revival of Christian Neoplatonism happening at that time. And what they report is the movement of Ruach HaKodesh, the divine spirit appears. So something profound was happening in Provence in the late 1100s. And in this cauldron of this mixture, out comes what came to be called later the Kabbalah, meaning an emanatory system moving from the infinite, the Ein Sof, sometimes called machshava, thought, sometimes called ratzon, pure will, all the way down to the lower realm, sometimes called Shekhinah, the indwelling of the divine presence, sometimes called Malchut, the sovereignty, but kind of a Gnostic sovereignty. Because when you read books on the Kabbalah and you study Shekhinah Malchut, Shekhinah doesn't mean what many people think today, some benign feminine indwelling of the divine. When you read about the Shekhinah in the Zohar and other texts, it is the Gnostic divine. Malchut is the broken kingship of David. So the goal of the Kabbalists is to repair the Shekhinah, is to repair Malchut. So now that you know something of Gnosticism and you study the Shekhinah, by the way, there's a book by Isaiah Tishby, Tishby, called The Wisdom of the Zohar, originally in Hebrew, in English. And he takes the Zohar and divides it up into terms and concepts. His section on the Shekhinah is one of the longest sections in the book. And I remember when I was coming up where the Shekhinah was the feminine dwelling of God, some kind of, very pleasant overflow from the divine. When I read about how the Shekhinah is actually portrayed in the Zohar, it was very upsetting to realize, not that people were trying to mistreat, because any generation can take a word and use it for their own purposes, but no one ever taught me what the Shekhinah actually was. And by the way, as I've taught rabbinical students over the years, and I've gone through this material, people who have never heard of this actually get offended that the Shekhinah is not what they thought it was. They say, what's your evidence for this heretical thought? And I say, well, let's look at Isaiah Tishby's Wisdom of the Zohar. He cites every passage, and people are kind of crestfallen, like something they believed in was just taken away. I said, no, you can still believe that the Shekhinah is the overflow of the divine feminine presence. You can believe that. You don't have to believe what the Zohar says. Just know that the Zohar says it. Okay, so it is an emanatory system that has both a Neoplatonic feel in some of the early Kabbalistic Neoplatonic texts. It's the lenses are names of God. So it's one name of God after another descending from the infinite down to our realm. That's the more Neoplatonic version. The more Gnostic version is it descends into something of a brokenness. Another Gnostic theme that develops very early in the Kabbalah is the origin of evil. That one of these emanations breaks off and creates a separate world called the Sitra Achra, the other side. All this happens in the first 100 years of the Kabbalah. Let's say from about 1170 to 1270. It goes from the north of France to the, south of France to the north of Spain. And then the Zohar comes into being. So my next paragraph of thought is going to be the Zohar. Any questions on the early history of the Kabbalah before we get to the mature Kabbalah of the Zohar? Again, I hope I'm not going way too fast. I'm trying to be descriptive and efficient. I hope I'm not leaving anybody behind. If you feel left behind, please formulate a question. It would be like asking what was happening in Berkeley in the 60s? What happened in the LA music scene in the 60s? How did Marburg become such an important city in the history of Germany? So there are times when a certain city like Tzfat, there are times when a certain region or city in the world, from a variety of forces that people, when they look back upon, they say, oh, yes, of course, there was this, this, and this. But when you're in it, you can't see it coming. So what was happening in the south of France? First of all, an extraordinarily talented group of mystics whose mysticism was rooted in Merkava mysticism, Neoplatonic mysticism, who had the sense of the Holy Spirit among them. So they were already mystics. So you needed that element. The next thing you had was the appearance of Sefer Bahir. That was an emanatory system. How did Sefer Bahir get to the south of France from Babylonia? That's a great question. Who brought it there? We think we know who. Talk about that another time because I'm very unsure about the evidence, but there's a theory on an itinerant Jewish geographer, as it were, who may have lugged Sefer Bahir from Babylonia to the south of France. So what else is happening? There is the Gnostic heresy of the Cathar movement is happening also in the south of France. I mean, it's not the south of France. I think it's more Western France, but word gets around. I mean, there are massacres. If I'm not mistaken, this is where the general of the Pope's army, when he was getting ready to destroy a Cathar city, people said to him, well, how are you going to know which one's a Gnostic and which one's not? He said, kill everybody, let God sort it out. If you've ever heard that, people say that's the first attribution of that quote. Again, I'm not sure. I read it in a book. Another thing is there is the greatest Christian Neoplatonist, John Scotus Erugenia, John the Scotsman from Ireland. I've read about him all I can, but again, his writings are just enormous. But the consensus is probably the greatest mind in the history of Christianity who was a Neoplatonist. Now, Neoplatonism goes in and out of favor with Christianity because some people don't like the idea that God emanated the Logos down from the Father all the way down to the Son with all these intermediaries. Some people just like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they didn't like this Neoplatonic complexity. So Greek thought in general, Neoplatonism in particular, sometimes is integrated into Christianity, sometimes pushed out of Christianity. So John Scotus Erugenia, if I'm not mistaken, he's in the 8th century, really during the Renaissance of European culture that happened under the Franks, under Charles the Great. We would call Charlemagne, Karl der Grosse, Charles the Great. We don't realize it, but he founded university systems and was a great patron of philosophy. We think they were called the Dark Ages. They were not dark. They were full of light, starting about the 8th century. So if I'm not mistaken, he was, enjoyed that university system. He came from Scotland, Ireland, England over to France. And he wrote, and his books were loved, and then they were pushed, they were marginalized. What's happening in the south of France in the late 1100s? There's a resurgence of the study of John Scotus Erugenia. Nobody knows really why, other than it had been gone long enough. Here's my reconstruction. Somebody finds it in an old library and says, have you guys read this? They go, what is it? John Scotus Erugenia. Never heard of the guy. Just read one page. And someone said, you got any more of this? So I think it's banished, and then it just makes so much sense. So Roland, we don't have an explanation why we have these moments of profound cultural shifts. All we know is that it happened, and then a guy like Gershom Scholem wants to come in and try to explain it. That's the best I can do. We don't know why. The next topic is the Zohar. How does the Zohar come into being? This is a fascinating idea. So all this time that you have Kabbalistic philosophy being developed, they never try to link it up with the text of the Torah. Just here and there, somewhat randomly, accidentally. So what do you find? Suddenly there's a desire to take Kabbalistic philosophy, 100 years, become very sophisticated. You have the text of the Torah, and Kabbalistic philosophy is smushed through the text of the Torah, and out comes the Zohar. If you read the Zohar, you will learn nothing about what the Torah says. What you will read is the Kabbalah developed by hooks from verses in the Torah. When you look at how a verse from the Torah is treated in the Kabbalah, it is not recognizable. You have no idea how anybody could come up with that because they're not commenting on the Torah. They're taking Kabbalistic thought, running it through the text of the Torah, and producing this vast, complex, mysterious document called the Zohar. Now, Gershom Scholem, by the way, there's an entire library of books written on the Zohar. I'll just go back to Gershom Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, 1941. He identifies 20 different genres in the Zohar. So think of the Zohar as an accumulation of pamphlets put together by one scholar, Moshe de Leon. He was an original author of most of the Zohar, but what he also did is collected pamphlets around northeast Spain, cobbled them together. And as you're reading, you can almost tell when one author ends and a new author begins. You can move from, oh, wow, this really feels like Neoplatonism. And then suddenly you're in the murky, disturbing depths of Gnosticism. And then a new genre, the old man or the young child. So if you read any book on the Zohar, you can look at the genres of the Zohar, the stages of the Zohar, the pamphlets of the Zohar. When I study the Zohar, I just go one page after the other. I know what the genres are. I say, oh, wow, so we have this. So I've never studied the Zohar by genre. I just study it page after page. I've never completed the Zohar, by the way. I don't think I've read more than about 30, 40 pages continuously. What I usually do is I look something up and I read 5 pages here, 5 pages there. I thought to myself, is that a goal of mine to read the Zohar front to back? Actually, not. I got other things on my plate, and it's not reading the entire Zohar in Aramaic. So if somebody else wants to do it, tell me how it ends, because I just really want to know. Okay? Who's the greatest scholar of the Zohar? Daniel Matt, M-A-T-T. One of the greatest modern scholars of Kabbalah in general, and the Zohar in particular, with his what's called the Pritzker translation. The Pritzker family in Chicago, the foundation hired him and gave him a lifetime stipend to translate the Zohar. I knew Daniel Matt. So I remember when he told this circle of people, it was great news for everybody. Who knew, right? Okay, so the Zohar comes into being, and then that starts to dominate the Kabbalah. Now, there are other Kabbalists. Abraham Abulafia is a name that you'll encounter. Joseph Gikatia. So there are other early Kabbalists, but they all get, as it were, marginalized by the power of the Zohar. But they're still there. You can look up the work of Abraham Abulafia. By the way, not everything has been translated. I notice on my Facebook feed, a guy named Avi Solomon starts to show up on my Facebook feed, and he's translating an as heretofore untranslated book of Abraham Abulafia. And then he puts in his Facebook feed, he said, if anybody wants to become a patron, please go to my Patreon page. So I said, happily, I went to his Patreon page. So now I'm officially supporting a further translation of the work of Abraham Abulafia. Not a lot, but he said thank you very much. So it's enough to get a kind thank you. So the translation of Abulafia is ongoing. It's just an extensive literature. All right, so we have the development of the Zohar, which takes over the study of Kabbalah. It has its Neoplatonic elements. It has its Gnostic elements. And to be a Kabbalist meant you studied the Zohar. The next part of the story, we're restarting the teaching, welcome back, is of course Isaac Luria, Yitzchak Luria. So I found a little pamphlet on HebrewBooks.org where they had a text called Shivchei Ha'ari. It means in praise of the Ari, Ashkenazi Rabbi Yitzchak, Isaac Luria, which is folk tales about the Ari. The author of this little pamphlet is just profoundly effusive and apparently accurately about his range of Torah knowledge. In Egypt, as a young man, he was recognized to be one of the greatest Talmud scholars of his time. He gained mastery, in my opinion, of the Gnostic Neoplatonic tradition. He mastered the Zohar, integrated everything, and at a certain point decided to make Aliyah in 1570. So he was 36 when he went to Tzfat. Unfortunately, he dies at the age of 38. There's another really interesting book called, if I'm not mistaken, Shem HaGedolim, which is short biographies of every famous rabbi written in 1724. So Isaac Luria appears in that book. I have the book and I read the pages on Luria. Again, the author could not be more effusive. I mean, to the point that it outshines Moshe, it outshines the Rambam. If Isaac Luria had lived, no one would be able to survive the radiance of Luria. He died in 1572, never wrote a word. In fact, what he said was, if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to bring down a vast amount of, if I'm not mistaken, it was like the shemen, the oil of the divine light, into a tiny, tiny little tzinor that's lit at the end. And he would say, I can't write it because I can never say it all. Sometimes a student would show him what he said. He said, it's not what I said, which means if it wasn't complete, it wasn't it. So he would go into rapturous states. In this book, Shivchei Ha'ari, one page after another, are memories of students who told what it was like studying with Isaac Luria in Tzfat between 1570 and 1572. He dies. Different students write down everything they can remember. The most notable being a person with the same first name in two languages, Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital is Hebrew and Latin. So he wrote a collection of Lurianic teachings that came to be called the Eitz Chaim. He named it after himself, not Isaac Luria. I guess that's okay. It was a laborious project. There was another recension in Italy, and Luria scholars study both, and they try to resolve them. It was a very big industry in the 1990s, 2000s. It kind of exhausted itself, and scholars of the Kabbalah are onto other things, which I can talk about in a moment. So, so what was the main contribution of Isaac Luria to Jewish spiritual psychology? And here's where it really begins to be profoundly meaningful to me, and I think to most of you. And that was, as Chaim Vital represents, what we would call the Lurianic myth. Now, Luria did much more than teach a theosophy, meaning an understanding of the cosmos that's not the traditional. The traditional we would call theology. The non-traditional we call theosophy. It's a made-up 19th or 20th century word to distinguish between these two forces. So what do we have in the some basic elements of the Lurianic myth? So first of all, it starts with the Ein Sof, with the infinite, as does most Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. He gives an image, though, that turns the idea of emanation completely on its head. Now, I forget where, but I found an antecedent of this term in ancient Gnostic literature. I just didn't memorize where. And I don't know if I'm going to reread everything to find it. And that's when I remember at that moment, I thought to myself, this guy has read ancient Gnosticism. I mean, it was clear to me that during his, I think it was 7 years, going to this incredible island that had churches and monasteries, and it was the island where they had this. You can look it up. This incredible tower that measures the height of the Nile. It's called Rota. You can look up Rhota island in the Nile. It's not a desolate island. It's richly populated. He went there for what's called Hitbodedut. Now, I think that has led to a problem with Luria scholars because Hitbodedut can mean literal isolation, meaning going out to the desert, but Hitbodedut can also mean contemplation. So when most people said that Isaac Luria spent 6 days a week in Hitbodedut on Rota, I got the impression it was a desert isle, like, with one lone palm tree, until I looked up the island. It's anything but a desert isle. It's magnificently architectured and highly populated. So I'm of the opinion, and I'm not a Luria scholar. So, I might get a nasty email from a Luria scholar that says, "You're all washed up, Finley. How dare you say things beyond your your pay grade?" My sense is when they said he spent time in Hitbodedut, they didn't mean physical isolation. I think he spent time in deep contemplation, studying ancient Gnostic Neoplatonic texts, mastered the Zohar just as he had mastered the entire Talmudic tradition, clearly a mind beyond brilliant, integrated everything, and said, time to go to Tzfat, 1570. He teaches all of this, dies young, other people inherit it. They organize Luria's teaching, the Lurianic myth, a very minor part of it. There are so many other parts of Luria that I can't even begin to describe. I've only focused on the Lurianic myth. So he begins in typical fashion with the infinite, but instead of shining down, he describes Tzimtzum as, I sometimes refer to it as a self-forming submarine in the Marianas Trench, meaning something developed to keep out the water. So the contraction is not in, the contraction is out. Now, this is one major misconception that people have about Tzimtzum, contraction. It is not withdrawing into itself in the sense of the center being pulled in. It's withdrawing out into itself to create a space for there to be creation. Now, this was such an unusual and radical teaching that it immediately, in the world of the Kabbalah, took on, and here's why. The ancient question, how can there be creation if God is infinite? And if you say God retracts into God's self, what does that mean? So he said, actually, God didn't retract into the heavens. God retracted and pulled back and created a sphere. So outside the sphere is the infinite. Inside the sphere is called the halal, the empty space, the non-God space. And that's radically important because you can already hear a bit of a Gnostic theme. We live in the non-God halal, the non-God space, which God had evacuated in order for creation to occur. So let's think about that. By definition, we live in the non-God. We live in the non-God because if God had not retracted, as it were, we couldn't exist. God leaves behind a vapor so that there is some sense of the divine still floating around. God sends in a ray of light. The ray of light is divided into these sphirot that we already talked about, the 10 sphirot. They crack and break apart, called the breaking of the vessels. They fall into the lower realms. These shards of the broken vessels are encased in what are called husks, klipot, and that's where we human beings arrived. We are the beings that bear the sparks and the husks, and our purpose in life is to break the husks, release the sparks, so that God, as it were, can be reconstituted from our work. Now, notice this says theology on its head. It's not that man proposes, God disposes. We pray and God decides whatever. It's very different. God is broken, and God can only be put back together by human effort. Now, this is a radical theology. The brokenness of God and the purpose of the human being to reconstitute God, to bring God back into whole form, because we bear within us shards of the divine encased in husks. And so our spiritual practices, by the way, in Luria, it was mostly meditative practices. Our practices break the husk, release the spark. This is called Tikkun HaKelim. So you have the emanation of divine light. You have Shavu'ot HaKelim, the sparks and the husks. And then the Tikkun HaKelim, which is our reconstituting, as it were, repairing the divine. Tikkun also means repair. That's why you hear the term repair the world. That comes straight out of Lurianic Kabbalah. So if you look at Lurianic meditations, a lot of it is transposing letters, transposing names of God. So meditations that in some mystical way break the husk and release the spark. But as I study Luria, there's really, again, I'm not a Luria scholar. There's very little focus on transformation of character. There is a very big focus on, if we reconstitute the divine, the Messiah will come. Now, why was there so much messianic fervor in this time? Remember, 1492 was the expulsion from Spain, and we can't even begin to measure the misery of the Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal that suddenly got banished to the Mediterranean basin. Many arrived in Turkey. Turkey, of course, controlled the land of Israel at the time. They dribbled into Tzfat. Great scholars or descendants of scholars who had suffered something as traumatic for us as the Holocaust, and thought, this can't be real. What God could permit this to happen? So some say the backstory of Luria is the destruction of the Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal, and that God would repair it. Now, God has been, as it were, retracted from the world. How can we bring God back into the world? By breaking the husk, releasing sparks. And how do we do that? Through a complex meditation. I have a Lurianic Siddur. I maybe have mastered one page of it. I've read some of these meditations of transposing letters and so forth. It doesn't do it for me. My contemplative practice is mostly one of, when I look at breaking husk, it's about character. It's about, working through the unconscious ego self. It's about tapping into grief and sadness and trying to expand love, justice, truth, and beauty. So my contemplative practice are not Lurianic meditations. What Luria did lead to, and this is an unintended consequence, is the great heresy of Shabtai Tzvi, who said, you want the Messiah? I'll be the Messiah. Of course, he wasn't the Messiah, or we wouldn't be talking about it. So he revealed himself in 1666. Things went bad very quickly. He died in 1676. And the failure of the Sabbatean messianism left a very bad taste about the Kabbalah. So that's when you have the ideas of you can't study it till you're 40, stay away from it, it's no good. I remember when I was a kid in Hebrew school, I said, what's the Kabbalah? Don't ask. Can I read it? Not till you're 40. I said, okay, well, that was all made up. Moshe Cordovero, one of the greatest scholars of Kabbalah in Tzfat, was 18 years old when he began writing Pardes Rimonim. So this idea you have to wait till you're 40, that's all made up. Where does it come from? The fear of the Kabbalah because of Sabbateanism. Who is a victim of this, by the way? Another person I'm not going to say more than two sentences about. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto lived in Italy. He became almost like a Luria figure in his mastery of Kabbalah with one mistake. He created a messianic circle in Padua in Italy, focused on himself. And when the rabbis of Italy heard about this, they said, get out of town. You can't do this here. And so he was banished from Italy, went to the Netherlands, which is more hospitable to people like him, as they had been hospitable to Baruch Spinoza. He says, I'm going to go to Eretz Yisrael. So he takes a boat to Eretz Yisrael, gets off the boat, and dies in a plague in Jaffa. Okay. Also, if I'm not mistaken, 38 years old. By the way, if you make it past 38, you might be good to go. Because if anybody here is not yet 38, take care of yourself. When you turn 38, 39, you're probably safe. Now, I might be mistaken. Maybe the Ramchal didn't die when he was 38, but for some reason, number 6 in my head. So that's exactly right, Randy. As far as I know, there's almost nothing in Lurianic Kabbalah which is about character transformation. It did lead to false messianism, which pushed the Kabbalah into very, very esoteric circles that you couldn't break into. So if there were they called them a klaus, a closet in Europe. They also had them throughout North Africa, the Middle East, where you had Kabbalah scholars. They wouldn't let anybody in. I mean, if someone said, I want to study Kabbalah, they would vet you, and most people couldn't get in because they knew this is powerful medicine that can go very bad. So the Kabbalah was restricted to people that the Kabbalists felt had enough maturity to study this, but it was highly guarded. So that's going to go from the late 1600s to the middle 1700s in what's called Russia, Ukraine, Poland, that area. So that will be my next topic of conversation. And by the way, I've been teaching this ever since I learned this when I was 23 years old. And the minute I studied, I read Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism in a mysticism class when I was 23, majoring in religion at USC. I've told this many times. The professor said, I don't get this Kabbalah. I focus on Eastern mysticism. If you read this book and give the lecture, you get an A. I was getting an A anyway, but I was up to the challenge. So I'm reading the book. I'm starting with Gnosticism. I'm like plugging through. I hit the chapter on Isaac Luria, and I just felt goosebumps. I felt the hair standing on my head. I had discovered the truth. Now remember, truth, a poetic truth. And what's the poetic truth? When you discover your brokenness, you haven't discovered what's wrong with you. When you discover your brokenness, you've discovered your life's work. The person who has not discovered their brokenness can't do their life's work. If you don't discover your brokenness, your life is without meaning and without purpose. You're avoiding the truth from a Lurianic perspective. So sometimes people say to me, well, I don't like the term brokenness. I say, so don't like brokenness. I think the Kabbalists would just say, yeah, right, you'll get there. Meaning a person who has not encountered their shvira, their brokenness, cannot do the work of repair, of breaking husk and releasing sparks. So when I read that and I began to review my life, which in some ways was way better than everybody else's, but in some ways, had some difficulty. I thought to myself, wow, so I've absorbed my own brokenness and the brokenness of people around me. It's surrounded in husks. So when you discover the shards, I want to say this very emphatically. Typically, and I find this mostly in politics, by the way, here in the United States, but formerly it was religion. Ever since religion got pushed out with secularizations become politics, there's a Gnostic tendency to attribute brokenness to the other side. Capital O. I don't have brokenness. Those nasty Democrats are broken. Those nasty Republicans are broken. Right? There's some other group that bears the brokenness. I don't. That's straight up Gnosticism. That is strengthening the husk. Someone who thinks that way, you are encasing the light in a husk because you believe it. You believe that only you and only your side has the light. Those other people are forces of darkness. the Sitra Achra is laughing the whole time. The Sitra Achra is saying, I got you. The minute you find yourself hating some other group because you disagree with them, the Sitra Achra is chortling with glee that it got you. So as I looked at this and I looked at myself, I thought to myself, the worst thing I can do is hate people. By the way, one of the bylines of Isaac Luria, by the way, on the positive character development, was the constant recitation of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Love others as you would like to be loved. Now, why does it say it in the Torah? Not for the people that you love, it's for people that you don't love. So we're not commanded to do something easy, we're commanded to do things that are difficult. It's very difficult to imagine the people that you really don't like and say, God, even they have a neshama. They're carrying brokenness. How do I deal with their brokenness? By hating them, by defaming them, by labeling them, calling them names? It's not going to help them through their brokenness. So these Lurianic ideas have taken root in me and really shaped my entire spiritual, moral, and political life. I mean, I can't overstate the power of the Lurianic myth in my development as a human being, certainly as a Jew, as a rabbi, as a teacher. It is part of who I am. So this idea that we're already born into non-God space, let's not make it worse. Let's actually try to fill it back up with God. All right, so we're going to now go to the middle 1700s. What happens? As I described, I think last time, the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, born in around 1700, he's a Kabbalist. So he's known as a storyteller. If you read Martin Buber's books, he's a guy who tells stories and people tell stories about him. That's what I thought the Baal Shem Tov was. Until I began to study the first generation of the students of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, was an accomplished Kabbalist. He was a Kabbalist. He has a visionary experience where he is brought up into the chamber of the Messiah, and the Messiah says to him, you can start teaching the secrets. Just be very careful. It's an extensive letter. By the way, he describes it it's an extensive experience. He describes it it was a powerful experience. He describes it in an extensive letter to his brother-in-law. It's authentic. Scholars have decided it's authentic. So you can look up anywhere, letter of the Baal Shem Tov to his brother-in-law. It'll come right up. This is his anointing. This is his calling. And one of the first things he teaches is Lurianic meditations have no more power. They were powerful in Luria's time, not our time. Stop with the Lurianic meditations. What do we do? What do we do? Now that we're here, what do we do? So last time I quoted from the first two lines of what is called the Shavu'ot Haribash, the core teachings of Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer. Now, this is accumulated by his students, but they are authentic interpreters of what he said. So I'm going to read you remember from last time? The first two things that are in this book. By the way, it's in English. It's called The Ethical Will of the Baal Shem Tov. Let's see. Shavu'ot HaRibash, the ethical will or the testament of the Baal Shem Tov. Liyot tamim be'avodato. Be whole in your divine service. Avodah tama. Whole. Okay? This goes back to the Ramchal, help me out here, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. His book, the Mesilat Yesharim, was about Ha'adam Hashalem. So this idea of the whole person, Tom in Hebrew means wholeness. Now, what is the first line of the testament of the Baal Shem Tov? V'ikar shelo lishkoach hadorim. Don't forget any of this. Forgetfulness is the activity of the Yetzer Hara and the Sitra Achra. The Sitra Achra says, you can go ahead and study. I'll just make sure you forget. Ve'ikar lilmod bechol yom shiur musar hen rav hen ma'at. More or less. So people would say, musar, which has a sense of, serious inner work, and isn't Hasidism filled with joy? So sometimes when I would teach Musar, and I would have Hasidic rabbis say to me, "Oh, Finley, stop with the dour, solemn Musar stuff. Join the ecstasy of the Hasidism." Right? So I knew this line. First thing that the Baal Shem Tov says is, don't forget anything. Study Musar every day. Hen Rav, hen Ma'at, little or not. So notice a fundamental part of the wisdom work that I teach: daily work on your character. Straight out of here. If you're not doing daily work, you will forget. That's the Baal Shem Tov. So what did I take from this? Any system of transformation that does not include daily training is not a system of transformation. Straight out of the Baal Shem Tov. And then we have to cleave to ourselves midot tovot, qualities of good character, hanhagot yesharot, spiritual practices that are yashar, straight up. It goes on and on. It's a wonderful book. And one thing as I'm thinking about what to do for my doctor said I got 20, 30 years ahead of me, so I got to fill it up. So I think I'm going to teach Hasidism for the next 20, 30 years. There's so much here. I mean, look at this book. I mean, it's inexhaustible in its depth. So the Baal Shem Tov comes along and says, we're done with Lurianic meditations. We're going to focus on, and he doesn't even teach the Lurianic myth, by the way, very much. I mean, not publicly. Let me give you one anecdote, one of my favorite anecdotes about the Baal Shem Tov. So as he reveals himself, now I'll tell you a few Baal Shem Tov stories. As he reveals himself, there's a well-known Kabbalist who comes to test this young upstart. He's his senior in age and learning. This is Dov Be'er of Mezrich. So he comes to, they say, hey, and he's ill. According to the story, he's very ill. And they say, go to this Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov, by the way, means an amulet maker. So as I recall the story, I'm not going to an amulet maker. No, he's more than an amulet maker. Go see this guy. He's a young upstart. Go see the guy. He goes in, and the Baal Shem Tov says, okay, I'll take you on. What do you know about, and he quizzes him on ancient Talmudic mysticism, if I'm not mistaken, some aspect of what's called Hechalot, meditations of ascension, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm mistaken, I'm not very mistaken. So according to the story, Dov Mezrich recites some passages that he knows. And the Baal Shem Tov looks at him. Apparently he's sitting down because he's ill. Says, is it customary where you come from to teach this stuff sitting down? So Dov Be'er of Mezrich stands up. So I recall the story. The Baal Shem Tov then teaches back what he just learned. And Dov Mezrich says, the walls disappeared, and I was in the company of angels, which means the Baal Shem Tov, by teaching it, I didn't have to ascend to the higher worlds. The higher worlds descended and encompassed me. And, the vision ends, and the Be'er of Mezrich says, I'm your student. What just happened here? And it wasn't the teaching. It was being in the radiance of the Baal Shem Tov. So Dov Be'er of Mezrich, if I'm not mistaken, was his first senior student. He had several around him, all competent Kabbalistic scholars, and we know this from the books that they wrote. So they are evidence that the Baal Shem Tov was not, he also told stories, but he was a Kabbalist, and he told stories to communicate deep Kabbalistic ideas in the simplest way possible. because he wanted this to radiate out to everybody. Okay, so Baal Shem Tov is a Kabbalist. By the way, if you pick up Martin Buber's The Tales of the Hasidim Early Masters, there was a time on our Friday nights together, I was reading Baal Shem Tov stories. Remember some of those stories? The mind-blowing stories. I'll review them. I mean, he's a holy man fighting demons, as he's coming up, and then finally he gets the gets the divine call. So in any case, with his disciples, he's more or less saying, get off this Kabbalah. Get off this complex Kabbalah. There's good stuff there, but you got to take what's called the nafkamina, like ma yotzeh mizeh. What's the essential thing you're trying to teach? So when you look at the most notable student was Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, Toldot Yaakov Yosef. Maybe the other way around. Anyway, as I read it, I said, wow, this guy's complex. He's a great scholar. And he drills this down to something that pierces the heart. And he says, as my teacher taught me. Okay, so that's what's going on. Now, one thing that is essential to his teaching, remember, is from the Torah portion. I think it's Genesis 6:8. I could probably mistake him, where it says, put a deck prism in the ark. The Hebrew word ark can also mean a word. So he says, when you're studying Torah or using the prayer book, you put a prism into the word to light up the lower decks. And there you will find worlds and angels and souls. So you don't have to do any complex Lurianic meditations. You just got to read Torah slowly and realize that every word has impossible depths, but especially the prayer book. Now, why did he want to do this with a prayer book? Because in those days, every Jew had a prayer book. Everybody, at least they davened. They might not know much else, but at least they picked up the Siddur and spent a little bit of time with it. So everybody knew Asher Yoshe Beitecha. They knew a few things. Well, let's just take this word and go deep, and take this word and go deep. However much you know one word, one sentence. Everybody knows Baruch Atah Adonai. Right? Go into the full depths of each word. So this is in a section called Amud HaTfilah, the pillar of prayer, where he's teaching the skill of entering into the depth of every word. Now, he teaches much more than this, but if you want one takeaway of the Baal Shem Tov, is use your soul, as it were, to bring light to the word and shine into the depths of the holy word, so the depths of the holy word shine back into you. You've got to bring your light into the word, light up the inner chambers, and then that fills you, and then we become, as it were, co-creators of meaning. We're reading the text, and the text is reading us, as I sometimes say. Okay, so this is the, again, I'm greatly summarizing, but if you want one takeaway from the early teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, so where are we at today? Where we're at today is you have the industry of scholarship. And as we discussed a couple times ago, the scholars are typically not practitioners, typically. But they provide translations. For example, this is the most recent version of the Tanya, where Chabad Hasidism has their own scholars. I don't know any other school that has the kind of scholarship that Chabad has. This is an incredible text. The introduction to Chabad mysticism, the appendix of this is stupendous. The book is worth it just for the appendix. But for people like me, I couldn't do this without Gershom Scholem, without Joseph Don, without Rachel Elior, a whole list of people that are great scholars. But then it comes down to people like me, and I'm not a scholar of the Kabbalah. I mean, I taught it as a professor, but my degree is not in Jewish mysticism from the Hebrew University. I have a doctorate in religion and social ethics, so I understand religion. I mastered the languages, I've mastered some texts, but my focus is not writing papers and translations on the Kabbalah, to get tenure. My focus is to change people's lives. I have to tell you one anecdote I think I've said before. When I had my first student pulpit in Boise, Idaho, there was a professor of English, and I was pretty open about the fact that I hoped to become a professor and not a congregational rabbi. His name was Jay King, professor of English at Idaho State. And I used to visit people in their homes. I stayed in various homes in my visit there, didn't have a hotel room. So one time I stayed with Jay King and his lovely family. And Jay said to me, I was a rabbinical student, but he called me Rabbi. Rabbi Finley, please don't become a professor. Please become a congregational rabbi. Right? The bright minds like you get lifted off into professorships. Congregations need you. You got to show that this is possible in a congregation. Now, I don't know if we've done that, but we've done it for one congregation. I don't know if it means anything to anybody but us here at Or Torah and those of you who from the community who join in. But Mirav and I, when we founded Or Torah in 1993, we said, we're going to do this thing. We're going to create a neo-Hasidic experience in the way that we daven and study Torah. We gave ourselves, well, if we, first 5 years, first 10 years, we just kept buying another 5 years. I very much want to get back to teaching the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah. And I intend these, the 7 talks, including tonight, which is a summary, to be, a pretty good introduction for what comes next, which is the transformative work.